Forget the clumsy Disney monster, dancing tea set, and the rose in the jar. The original 18th century version of Beauty and the Beast contains harassment and perversion, as well as harmful behavior patterns for young women. Her characters are addicted to their traumatic experiences and driven by psychological complexes. A happy ending reveals the secret of incest. Today, we invite you to join us in exploring the depths of this ancient fairy tale and reveal its secrets and dark revelations that are hidden under the surface of the adapted and censored text. The story is probably as old as humanity, because similar fairy tales are present in the folklore of most peoples of the world. In some of them, the monster appears in the form of a snake, somewhere a horse or donkey, somewhere a lion or a wolf, and in some countries, a troll, dragon, or demon. The story is as old as the world. Beauties fall in love with monsters either under the influence of perverted sexual desires or controlled by injuries and complexes, including Stockholm Syndrome and the Savior Complex. Monsters fall in love with beauties as an unattainable ideal, and this theme is one of the richest for any playwright because it contains many opportunities for disclosure through the natural drama of the situation. Let's recall just a few of its variants in masculinity. The Hunchback of Notre Dame, the line of Belle and Rumpelstiltskin in the TV series Once Upon a Time, the film version of Bram Stoker's Dracula where a vampire monster falls in love with an innocent Mina, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of such examples. And one of the first fairy tales described in the fiction of civilized Europe was a fairy tale that we all know from childhood. It was first published in 1740 by the French short story writer Gabrielle Suzanne Barbeau de Villeneuve. It was more of a classic novel of several hundred pages than a children's fairy tale. The author of the abridged version in the format of a fairy tale for children was another French short story writer, Jean-Marie Le Prince de Beaumont. It is on this version that we'll rely, reminding you of the main plot, and on this backbone we'll build up the meat of the most famous versions, guesses, and theories. Sit back and immerse yourself in this controversial fairy tale. Once upon a time, there was a very rich merchant, and he had 3 daughters and 3 sons. But the most favorite was the youngest daughter, Belle, who stood out very much from other children. While the 2 older sisters were very pompous, greedy, and selfish, Belle, on the contrary, was kind-hearted and sincere, despite the fact that her beauty could compete with the sun and stars. She was often wooed by wealthy and respected gentlemen, but she always refused, because she wanted to stay close to her father, because she was very attached to him. It's because of this too strong connection with her father that she will later get into trouble. The merchant was doing well until one day he lost all his possessions and had only a country house somewhere in the middle of nowhere. Despite her poverty, Belle still had many applicants for marriage, but she chose poverty next to her father, abandoning her own comfort and future. The merchant and his brothers immediately began to set up the farm, and Belle worked hard from morning to night, helping them. At the same time, she also somehow found the time and energy to read, play the harpsichord, and sing. The young woman really stood out, as if she was not native to this family, both with her abilities in the arts and appearances and disposition. Perhaps she really had some secret of her origin, but we'll talk about this later. In the meantime, she was incredibly annoying to the sisters with her otherness, but Belle not only did all the housework for them, but also silently endured their constant insults, again, because of her father, so as not to upset him with quarrels. So, she did a lot of things in her life for Dad and through Dad. Why? Did the young beauty have no other incentives and desires in her life? Apparently, due to the fact that many psychologists see her dependence on her relationship with her father as an unresolved Oedipus complex. After all, we'll see later, she's so attached to her father that not only as an adult she still plans her future next to him, but is even ready to give her life for him. The Oedipus complex is a psychoanalytic term coined by Sigmund Freud to describe the unconscious desires of a child of the opposite sex for a parent in competition with a parent of the same sex. For example, boys manifest this as a subconscious attraction to the mother and rivalry with the father, and vice versa. This complex, according to Freud, occurs in the early stages of childhood development, usually between 3 and 6 years, and is part of psychosexual development. If a child successfully overcomes this conflict, it contributes to their healthy identification with a parent of the same sex and the formation of mature relationships in adulthood. But those who did not resolve this conflict in childhood, in adulthood, may have difficulties in relationships, and not only. Such a person may remain emotionally dependent on a parent of the opposite sex, unconsciously seek parental recognition, which is why he has difficulties with emotional independence and often does not achieve complete self-sufficiency. In addition, they may unconsciously look for a partner who's similar in character or even appearance to their parent, and this often leads to unequal or unhealthy relationships. It's likely that Belle has a similar connection with her father, an unhealthy fixation on him, and maybe an unconscious sexual attraction to a loved one of the opposite sex. Apparently, this is why she was not attracted to marriage, because in this case, girls sometimes have an aversion to sex because of the social taboo on incest. But back to the plot of the fairy tale. A little time passed, and the merchant received the good news that one of his ships had survived and was returning to the harbor. He was going to get to the city, and the older sisters sat down to make a long list of luxury gifts they wanted their father to buy from the proceeds. Belle also asked to bring her only an ordinary rose. However, as a true victim of the Oedipus complex, at first she asked for nothing but to see her father again as soon as possible. But he insisted, and she said the first thing that came to mind. In Havana, it turned out that all the property was fined for some violations, and as poor as before, the merchant went home empty-handed. His path led through a dark forest, a hurricane rose, a downpour hit, turned into snowfall, and he got lost. Exhausted and frightened, the merchant was already imagining his death when he suddenly saw a light ahead. It turned out to be a beautiful but somewhat abandoned palace, surrounded by stone statues of people that were creepy in their realism. Despite the fact that there was no one in the castle, the torches lit up as if by themselves, and the table in the hall of the palace was set and full of food and drinks. After eating, the merchant went to bed. In the morning, he was already waiting for beautiful new clothes and a cup of hot chocolate. The man decided that he had fallen into the possession of a good fairy, and all the time did not stop thanking the hostess out loud for her hospitality. When he was about to get on his horse and go home, he saw a beautiful rose garden near the castle walls, and, remembering the request of his beloved, plucked the most beautiful of the roses. And in this place, a children's fairy tale turns into a real horror. Suddenly, there was a terrible rumble and roar, and a terrible monster appeared in the front of the merchant. It had the body of a man, the head and fangs of a boar. An elephant's trunk grew on its muzzle, and its eyes burned with a red fire. It roared, bloodthirsty, and yelled at the merchant for his ingratitude, because despite the generous hospitality, he decided to steal a rose from the garden without permission. Agree, why make such a fuss because of some rose, and all because these roses were taken care of by the monster himself, and until then, they were the only living creatures who were not afraid of his ugliness, and responded with a generous flower to his care. Why was the monstrous beast so sensitive? An explanation will be provided later, when we get to know the fate of this hero more closely. Although the merchant did not apologize or explain, the beast continued to rage until he heard that the rose was intended for one of the 3 daughters. He was about to kill the merchant, but when he heard about the daughters, he stopped. The beast promised to forgive the merchant if one of his daughters voluntarily came to the palace and agreed to give her life in exchange for her father's. He had to swear that if that didn't happen, he would be back in 3 months. Of course, the merchant agreed to buy some time, but the condition itself was more than strange. Why does the beast need a daughter? After all, he could demand a son. Who cares who he devours? But everything turned out to be much more complicated. Despite this rage and bloodthirstiness, the man-beast for some reason filled a huge chest with gold and promised the merchant to deliver it to home so that the guest would not return empty-handed. And the rose for which he made such a fuss was allowed to leave, and in general, in the future, he behaved politely. What is this sudden change in emotion? Maybe because the beast was just incredibly bored and wanted to entertain itself in some way? Or maybe from loneliness and disbelief that something could be changed, it really teetered on the edge between animal rage and humanity. There's a theory that the beast, alone being in the skin of an ugly monster for so many years, really began to gradually lose human features and was increasingly fascinated by the animal essence. But most likely, a plan popped in his head. He played a play. At first, he intimidated the merchant so much that he did not doubt the inevitable death, and then gave him a rare opportunity to survive. Anyway, he let the merchant go, having a chance to get a new toy for himself, an even more interesting one, a girl. This beauty was supposed to be a potential savior of the beast from an ancient curse. When the children met their father at home, the merchant tearfully told them everything. Everyone was in shock, but Belle didn't cry, unlike the sisters who were emphatically wringing their hands and wailing. She'd already made up her mind. The girl simply said that she would gladly go instead of her father, because life without him would not be happy for her, and he suffered precisely because of her whim. When everyone, exhausted from grief and fatigue, went to bed, the merchant saw by the bed the very chest full of gold, which magically ended up there. This is the first Belle, and we have to understand that with the beast. In addition to its terrible appearance, not everything is so simple because it clearly possessed some kind of magic. By the way, about the appearance. Behind the image of the beast, as well as in general the idea of this fairy tale, there was a real sad and cruel story. This was the story of Petrus Gonsalves, who was born in 1537 on the island of Tenerife. At the age of 10, his parents sold him as a toy to the French King Henry II because the boy had a unique flaw. He suffered from congenital hypertrichosis, and his entire body was covered with thick hair. At court, Petrus received a brilliant education while remaining a joy for the nobility. After the death of Henry II, Gonsalves as a thing became the property of Catherine de' Medici, who for fun made the young man marry her maid, who was distinguished by an incredible beauty. Medici was interested in setting up an experiment on what kind of children such a couple would have. Subsequently, the couple was given as a strange gift from one royal court to another, so Petrus Gonsalves really spent his entire life in the most beautiful and luxurious palaces in Europe. True, not as the owner, but as a fancy pet. 200 years later, Gabrielle de Villeneuve was inspired by the image of a man-beast married to a beautiful girl. But back to Belle and her decision. Not everyone would agree to sacrifice themselves for the sake of their father, who has so long to live because of his advanced age. For Belle, this was the apogee of the Oedipus complex. What about the father? He accepted his daughter's sacrifice and let her fall into the clutches of a dangerous beast like a slave. I wouldn't give him title Father of the Year, would you? So on the appointed day, the young women went to the beast's castle. In the beautiful palace, she was greeted by a set table, and when Belle sat down to a sumptuous dinner and the beast appeared, her heart froze for a moment with fear. Why, like any normal person, did she not scream, cry, or lose consciousness in the end? For Belle was indeed not quite an ordinary woman, and above all, because of her true origin, which she did not know yet at the time. So who was Belle? You won't believe it. A young woman who was so in love with her surrogate merchant father was a changeling fairy, also of royal blood. That's right. De Villeneuve tells about this in her novel at the very end. The real father of this girl was the king, and the mother was a light fairy. Because of the illegality of this marriage to a man, the mother ended up in a fairy prison. An envious dark fairy who wanted to marry the king to herself hired assassins to take the newborn royal daughter to the forest and kill her. Fortunately, the fairy godmother, Belle, found out about this, turned into a bear, tore the killers to pieces, and left the baby to the merchant. In general, it's a very common practice for fairies to kidnap a human child and replace it with their own. This time, the fairy replaced the merchant's newborn daughter, who was very ill, with a half-blood. Whether she would have survived or not is unknown, but we have what we have. Belle got into the merchant's family and grew up in it as a beloved, albeit somewhat strange child. Maybe it was because of this that the beast didn't scare her as much as it could have. Fairies are very close to all living things, have an innate connection with nature, and their perception of the ugly and beautiful is also somewhat different from that of humans. In addition, the beast was initially very polite and caring to her. His speech was correct and refined, although he was clearly not distinguished by intelligence. The woman intuitively felt that he had a good heart. Especially for Belle, he arranged a room where there was everything that was dear to her heart. The palace itself was full of magic, entertainment, and interesting things that the main character explored every day. On her travels through it, in the beautiful garden, she was always accompanied by monkeys, parrots, and other amazing creatures who behaved as if they had a human mind. Day after day passed, and the woman grew increasingly convinced she was in no danger here. The owner of the castle seemed to possess an almost magical ability to recognize and fulfill her every wish, even though she had never spoken aloud. And night after night, Belle dreamed of Prince Charming and sometimes spent many hours trying to find a place where the beast could hold him, convinced that he was imprisoned somewhere in the palace. Every evening at dinner, the woman met with the beast, and after each dinner, he asked her if she would agree to marry him. And each time, afraid that this time it would be her last words, refused him. And the disappointed and angry beast, with a passionate howl and growl, walked away. And here we'll focus in more detail on the personality of the beast and who he is and why he needs Belle. Why hadn't he killed the stubborn beauty in the fury of his animal nature? Let's forget the cautionary tale in which the beast is a pompous and arrogant prince who was turned into a beast by a good fairy as a punishment for his rudeness. This is a fairy tale for kids, so that they're polite. This prince was actually an ordinary and young and handsome guy. Unfortunately, he became the object of sexual desire for a dark fairy who was almost 1,000 years old. Of course, she didn't look like a fairy, and who knows if there was something between them or not. But when he refused to marry her, she cursed him out of rage and turned him into a monster. The only way to get rid of the curse was the love of a young maiden. She had to love him like a beast and agree to marry him, and no living soul had to know about the beast's true identity. Otherwise, it would have remained so forever. The good fairy godmother intervened here too, so that none of the servants could divulge the secret. She turned all the inhabitants of the palace into stone statues. It was these creepy sculptures that stood around the castle. But she turned her djinn servants into monkeys, parrots, and other animals to look after the beast and be his assistants. This is the true story of the beast. So it wasn't spoiled from the start, but years and years of loneliness and endless search for attempts to get rid of the curse left their mark. Belle probably wasn't the first woman he'd managed to somehow lure into his palace and try to persuade or force to marry him. According to one popular version, by the time he met Belle, he was already 21 years old. 21 years of frustration, despondency, and failed attempts. What happened to all the previous women the beast had tried to care for? In one of the films, based on the fairy tale, a beast threatens a beautiful woman to throw her into prison. She would starve to death if she didn't agree to dine with him. We can assume that this has actually happened more than once in the past. It was Belle, because of her fairy origin, who adequately perceived the beast's appearance and was able to see its soul. And because of her kind and unspoiled disposition, she was not attracted to his cosmic wealth and the luxury of the palace. While other girls, probably, he lured to him precisely with his wealth, but despite the promised treasures, they could not stand his bestial nature and broke down. According to this version, the beast is even sometimes compared to a Bluebeard because of the number of potential brides he killed in the basement of his palace. In any case, Belle spent 3 months in the beast's palace, growing increasingly attached to him. To her surprise, she realized that she even loved him, though only as a friend. She was very sorry that the beast was so repulsive for all its kindness and caring attitude towards her, and if not for its appearance, she would probably have agreed to marry. It's unlikely that such thoughts are possible for a pure and kind heroine of a Disney cartoon. The fact that he was regularly interested every day in whether she would agree to marry him, and was shocked by the real grief of being refused, was already beginning to annoy her. But in fact, at this stage of their relationship, Belle had already fallen into the trap set for her by her own psyche. The woman was a victim of Stockholm Syndrome. As a voluntary hostage of the beast, she began to feel sympathy for him at first, which gradually grew into a tender attachment. This syndrome is a kind of defense mechanism of the psyche, which is subconsciously resorted to by hostages for survival. They must adapt to the environment, and in order to somehow manage their fear, they start a program of identifying themselves with their jailer in order to begin to perceive and understand them. According to statistics, it's women who are more susceptible to this syndrome. Therefore, over time, Belle not only stops being afraid of the monster, but also begins to enjoy his company. And the further it goes, the more it tries to sweeten this captivity for her, the more he finally inclines her to himself. And even later, when he allows her to leave, she voluntarily returns back. In addition, Belle always felt the need to be loved and treated with affection. That's why she's always been so nice and kind to everyone. If you follow the version that the beast has been waiting for Belle for many years, and during this time there have already been many attempts at unsuccessful relationships, then it should be significantly older than the woman, almost twice. Thus, Belle moved from one dependent relationship with her father to another, with also a much older man. In general, the fairy tale had for the girls of that time a hidden lesson of obedience, beneficial for mercantile parents and society. In those days, young brides were a profitable commodity. They were married off for the benefit of the family. In cute young heads, using the example of this fairy tale, they instilled the cynical idea that an arranged marriage with an older, sometimes completely unfamiliar man is not so terrible. That no matter how terrible or stupid he may seem at first glance, if a young wife learns to see the kindness in his heart and loves even for this, he can turn into a brilliant prince for her. That's why Belle reflected in the pages of the book that she could have agreed under certain circumstances because she grew up in such a society. But not only Belle has surprises that her own psyche has prepared for her. The beast itself is also not doing so well with its internal state. Forced to live in isolation from the outside world, he suffers from depression and loneliness. And because of his appearance, he's tormented by self-loathing and self-doubt. Oddly enough, it's in the cartoon Disney version of the story that you can most clearly see the beast was in a state of depression. There are several scenes in which he's easily ready to just give up and die. He doesn't care if he lives, dies, or remains a beast forever. From the first meeting with Belle, he's convinced that the situation is hopeless, and only the servants convince him to at least try. For years, he simply wandered around his palace, living year after year without a purpose, because he completely despaired, lost faith in himself, and fell into a state of depression. In addition, this can be seen even from their dialogues in the original text. he has a very strong fear of being rejected. Where did it come from? All from the same previous attempts to get close to other women who were terrified of it, or at first pretended not to be afraid, tempted by its wealth. Some of them would rather die than feel any goodwill for him. Agreed, this did not give any confidence in itself and self-esteem. Isolation and all the other accompanying factors made the beast convince itself that it did not deserve happiness and was destined to remain alone forever. What happened this time to the beast, who had already passed many women through its chambers before Belle and failed? Why was he so worried and patient this time? The answer is simple. He really fell in love. Perhaps for the first time in his life. After all, the beauty was really very different from other women. And not only because of the fairy's blood. Her natural sincerity and openness stimulated him to change, to try to open his soul without fear of being rejected. That's why he endured Belle's refusals for so long and patiently, hoping that one day she would reciprocate his feelings. He was even willing that it would never happen, and that he would remain a beast forever as long as she was just there with him. As time passed, Belle missed her father more and more. One day in the magic mirror that showed her the house at her request, the woman saw that the merchant was ill and wanted to see him at all costs. She promised the beast, if he agreed to let her go home, to stay with him for the rest of his life. The beast, in love, was ready to do anything to ensure that the beauty did not feel unhappy and therefore agreed. At the same time, he told Belle that if she did not return, he would die of grief and longing. The woman, who at that time was already very attached to him, burst into tears and replied that she loved him too much to allow this to happen. Of course, as a friend, she said immediately. He gave Belle a magic ring that could carry her home and back to the palace, and the very next morning Belle was at home, and by her bed there was a huge chest full of precious dresses and other outfits. The merchant saw his favorite, instantly recovered from happiness, and then the sisters arrived, who at that time managed to get married, but both were unhappy. They almost died of envy when they saw that the youngest was dressed like a princess and looked even better than before. Their envy only increased when the girl told how happy she was all these months, and how kind and generous the owner of the palace turned out to be. The sisters conspired and came up with a plan to detain Belle longer than she promised the beast, so that it would get angry at their sister and punish her, depriving her of luxury and maybe even life. That's what black hearts these girls had. The treacherous sisters became so affectionate and sweet with Belle, showing her so much love that she was beside herself with happiness. When the time passed for her to return to the palace, they began to tear their hair, which could not withstand the grief of her departure. Despite their bad temper, Belle loved her sisters with all her heart, so she agreed to stay for another week. But each of those days she thought back to the beast, missed it, and felt guilty for the pain it caused. One night she had a terrible dream. The beast was dying and accusing her of ingratitude and cruelty. Belle hurried back to the castle, but the beast was nowhere to be seen. Then she rushed to the place she had seen in her terrible dream, and it was there on the shore of the lake that she saw his lifeless body. Fortunately, he didn't die. His heart was still beating, and the girl managed to bring him to his senses by pouring water from the lake. When he came to his senses, he confessed that he wanted to starve himself to death, unable to live without her. It was a real, not fairy tale attempt to pass away voluntarily. When with Belle's departure, life lost all meaning for him, and the depression that had been suppressed over the previous months blossomed again in full bloom. Then the beauty hugged him, resolutely promising herself to be the one who would save him from himself. From depression, bad thoughts, self-doubt. Another very toxic thing for a woman is to take on the mission of changing her man for the better. So, women have been living with alcoholics or substance addicts for years trying to save them, and when nothing works out and they break down again, such women blame themselves for not being able, loving, and supporting enough. This mission was assigned to Belle metaphorically, because it was she who was supposed to turn the beast into a prince with her love. So the women readers heard this false idea that any creature can turn into a prince only because of the love of a woman. Unlike in real life, in the book, a long-awaited happy ending begins at this place, when Belle confesses to herself and the beast that she really loves him, not just loves him as a friend. That she realized it only when she felt the fear of a terrible loss. Well, let's not rush to wipe away the tears of joy for our heroes. After all, the author of the original version of the fairy tale left the most interesting things for later. After all, in the original version of the fairy tale, at this happy moment, the beast did not turn into a human and remained a beast. They went back to the castle, sat down to dinner, and at the end of it, the beast asked again if Belle would agree to become his wife. And this time, finally, she said yes. But even here, it's still too early to be happy for them, because again, nothing has changed. The beast gave his future wife a hairy paw. She put her fragile hand in it, and they went together to the beast's bedroom. At this point, especially sensitive people and children should remain unaware of what happened that night outside the bedroom door. Only in the morning, as the fairy tale tells, when Belle woke up, she saw a beautiful prince next to her. Exactly the one she dreamed of during her stay in the palace. And then everything was like a merry-go-round. The prince woke up and finally confessed that he was cursed, and she saved him. And then two beautiful women materialized out of thin air, one of whom was a kind fairy, who it turns out took care of both of them from birth. The second woman was the prince's mother. And here the additional intrigue of this story is revealed. Belle learns the truth about the secret of her birth. Yes. Oh, it also turned out that Belle and Prince, who have already managed to get closer not only spiritually, are cousins. Therefore, incest was also added to bestiality. In principle, marriage with cousins were the norm for those times, so in principle, everything is okay. In addition, the bride was half fairy, and for their people, such connections are considered the norm, and some of them themselves can turn into animals. And here we finally awaited for a happy ending. The good fairy revived the stone sculptures, and the palace began the preparations for the wedding, and the evil sisters, to the delight of all of us, the fairy turned into stone sculptures, doomed to watch the happiness of their sister until they sincerely repent of what they did and rejoice in her happiness. Every popular fairy tale, especially if Disney made a film adaptation based on it, can seem quite innocent. But most fairy tales, especially old ones that have their roots in ancient folklore, contain dark storylines, hidden secrets, and their characters, even positive ones, are not always what we're used to seeing them. Stay with us to explore more famous fairy tale stories together in search of primary sources, true facts, and dark secrets.